Hello everyone, and welcome to the For Society for Kids Mental Health monthly In the Know education and networking webinar series. Funding is provided by the BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services, an agency of the Provincial Health Services Authority, and by the BC Ministry of Children and Family Development, in collaboration with the Kelty Mental Health Resource Centre. My name is Victoria Kettis, and I am a parent and resident with the For Society for Kids Mental Health, and we are broadcasting from BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver. All of our In the Know sessions have been recorded and can be viewed at our archives at any time. Please visit the Force website at www.forcesociety.com/inthe-know, and on the homepage you'll get a link to all the past sessions. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that everyone to fill out the In the Know feedback form after you finish watching this webinar. Online viewers can go directly to the online presentations link icon at the lower bottom of the screen on the right side. And it looks like a paperclip, and you'll find the feedback form there. In the resources section, you will find a downloadable copy of the PowerPoint about our topic, and you can review the webinar as often as you like. Our topic today is a celebration of the adolescent brain. You can also find the options when you're filling out those feedback forms to enter to win a $50 chapter gift card for filling out the feedback form. All information is confidential and is only used to collect feedback for you that helps develop our future In the Know sessions and topic ideas. So thank you for joining us, and now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Carol Ann Saari is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, medical director of the Provincial Youth Concurrent Disorders Program, and current president of the BC Psychiatric Association. Our webinar is a look at adolescent brain development and how it impacts attitudes, behaviors, emotions, relationships, and risk-taking, and what parents can do to support their youth. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Victoria. Okay, so we're here to talk about the adolescent brain and to celebrate it, which, sometimes I hear people say, I don't know that there's a whole lot to celebrate about this adolescent brain, but I'm hoping that by the end of this hour, or the end of this talk, you will join me in being very excited about adolescents and what their capabilities are, and also how they have contributed to the development of our species. So you see, I work as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, mostly with adolescents. I spend almost every day talking to young people. Not only that, but I'm also the proud parent of a teenager and a preteen and a child. So I get to see the whole range of brain development and feel the impact both on a personal level and a professional level every day. So because of that, I've been very interested in how brains develop and kind of knowing what's just typical. Because I work with kids who have mental illness and substance use, and I think, you know what? I don't know what kids are like just generally, other than my own daughter, and I don't know, maybe she's not typical. Who knows? So I started doing more research. I wanted to know more. And I found some fascinating information, and I thought it was imperative that I share it with other people because I think it's stuff we all need to know. So, first of all, I want to make sure you realize that I'm a clinician. I spend my day talking with young people, doing assessments, doing management, but what I don't do is I don't sit and do research all day. I have to rely on other people who do research, and I consider myself really a translator of that research. So I read the stuff and I bring it to people and try and put it into the kind of language that we can all understand. So from this talk, I want to, call out those people who've really done the research, and I would want to direct you if you're interested in this topic, if you think, I need to know more about this because it's so fascinating. Some of the people are doctors like Jay Geed, David Bainbridge, John Medina, David Suzuki, Dan Siegel, Lawrence Steinberg. I'll show you some links to some of their work at the end of this talk, but really they're the ones that are out there every day kind of learning more about adolescent brains and trying to get that information just out into the mainstream. Okay, so let's get started. So what we're going to try and do today is learn a bunch of things. I'm going to be talking about the changes that happen in an adolescent brain. We're going to kind of talk a little bit about what the physical changes are that happen. And then trying to understand how those changes actually create vulnerabilities for young people, for both mental illness and for substance use disorders. And also how those changes affect what they think about things, what their attitudes are. And then kind of looked at some principles for how parents can interact with youth or act in their parenting role to foster positive relationships going forward and keeping your kids engaged with you. So we're going to get started with these adolescents. And I'm sure you're looking, going, hello, not exactly the youngest of teenagers that I've seen. And that would be correct. You're actually looking at pictures of my mom and dad. They have agreed for me to show their pictures. Now, the reason I start with these guys is because last fall, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. So, we had a big party and everything. It was a lot of fun. That in itself is quite an amazing feat. But something else kind of was interesting for me. Because back when we celebrated it that day, my mom was 69 and my dad was 70. So if you're like me, you quickly do the math. You go, wait a second. She was 19 when they got married and my dad was 20. Well, of course, when I'm there that day, I'm talking about, how wonderful it is. And I look into the audience and I see my 15-year-old daughter. And I think, if my daughter came to me in 3 years, because my parents had only dated a year before they got married, by the way, came to me in 3 years and said, I've met this boy, we've dated a year, we think we're going to get married, and we just know it's going to work out because that's what happens. I would lose my mind, really. I would say, I don't think that this is a good idea. And I don't think I would be alone in that. I think many parents today would go, 19? Who gets married at 19? And why would they think that that would be successful to last 50 years? But when I look back at my parents, the night of their anniversary, there were 2 other couples there, friends of theirs, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversaries. And they were all kind of the same age when they got married. So, if we think about it, I don't think in 50 years there's been a big change in our brain development that we've suddenly dumbed down so much that we can't tolerate marriage anymore and it won't be successful. So what are we really talking about? We're talking about 2 different concepts. Adolescence is not only a change in the brain development and a biological process, but adolescence is also a social construct. Because 50 years ago, at 19, it was very typical for people to get married, to start their family, to have full-time jobs and live independently. Now at 19, young people are at a very different position. They're not leaving their homes at 19. They're often staying within the family unit, and they're launching a few years later. And it's not that their brains are any different than they were then, but our society approaches youth very differently now. And we kind of hold on to them a little bit longer. And we're not as supportive of young people going out and starting their families at a young age. Okay, so let's talk about this development of the brain, because that's really what we're going to focus on, not so much the cultural changes. When we look at the brain, we know that a huge part of brain development happens before the baby's even born, and in those first few years of life, we see these brains getting bigger. But really, that's what childhood is all about. It's the growth of all of the brain cells, the proliferation of the neurons, the brain cells. They just pack in so many more. There's more and more brain cells. And even by the time a child is 6, their brain is already 95% the size of an adult brain. So children are sponges. They just take on and take on and take on so much stuff. They have all this potential to do anything, really. Now, those brains they got the big brain, but it's not the most efficient brain. So with that increase in brain cells and potential, they have the potential to do anything anywhere. So you might have a part of your brain that would be really great if you developed to live in sub-Saharan Africa. But you're living in Vancouver. So you've got all this capability, but it's kind of taking up space because you're not using that part of your brain. So that's where the genius of our brains falls, in that we then start to change in adolescence and we start to renovate that brain. So we've got this big brain with all this potential, and the process starts to happen where it gets pruned. And it's pruning just like where you go out and prune a tree in your backyard. You cut away some of the branches that aren't adding to the growth of the tree. So this is the same thing. There's a process that goes in and starts clipping away those circuits in your brain that aren't being used. So if you're living in Vancouver, you might clip away the circuitry that would help you adapt and survive in Africa because you don't need it. On the other hand, you keep those circuitries that help you adapt and survive where you're at. So maybe the ones that help you learn the transit system in Vancouver, or where the libraries are. So this pruning is a behavior establishing machine. What that means is that the behaviors that you're using get kept. The behaviors that you're not using get pruned away. Now, this is a really genius way of adapting to your environment. But it also carries with it some risks that we're going to talk about later, because it's this use it or lose it philosophy, but the ones that you're using are also going to get much stronger. So if you think about some of those behaviors that might not be so adaptive, substance use or high-risk behaviors, those might be the ones that are kept and get stronger. The second part that happens in the brain development is myelination. Now, myelin is like this fatty layer that covers up the brain cell, and it helps the electrical signal of the brain travel really fast. So up to 3,000 times faster is the rate after you've gone through myelination. So this helps kids start to process things quicker. Where a younger child might have a harder time kind of just going from 0 to 100, when you get to the adolescence, things are starting to speed up, right? So now not only are you having some pruning and you're modeling your brain to be adaptive, but now you're making it go even faster and being more efficient. Okay. So that's all well and good. Now, the way that myelination happens and the pattern that it happens is actually very important. So what we can see is that in this picture, you'll see that the blue is the myelination. And what this is showing is that the process of speeding up the signals in your brain go from the back of your brain to the front of your brain. So in doctor speak, we say from the posterior to the anterior. Okay? And that's really important when we look at behaviors, because it's going to change what parts of the brain are maturing faster than other parts of the brain. So this is kind of a very, simplistic schematic of the brain. And I'm going to focus really on two areas. The area in the blue is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is made up of parts like the amygdala and the hippocampus, words you don't necessarily need to know. But the important part is what that part of the brain is responsible for. So the limbic system is really for your emotions. It's your drives. It's your motivation. It's your reward system. That all sits in this limbic system. It's kind of that primitive part of your brain that gives you that drive to eat food or have sleep, have sex, all of those things. And then your cerebral cortex is actually a part of the brain that didn't actually even develop until much later in the development of our species. And the very front part of the brain, if you look at this picture, the part where it says cerebellum, that's the back part of your brain. And the other side is the front part of your brain. You're kind of looking at this picture from the side and the left-hand side of your brain. The front part of that brain, called the prefrontal cortex, is one of the last parts of the brain to develop. And this didn't actually come online till about 300,000 years ago. Our species didn't really develop this part of the brain. And it's interesting because at that time, when the front part of the brain started to develop, is also the time that our species started to have teenagers. We started to live longer. Okay? There's some theories about what came first. Did we need to have teenagers in order to have brain development and actually move to this place where we were able to have higher cognition? Because it actually seems that the teenagers came before the brain development. So I think that's just interesting. I don't know, it's a theory. I'm not sure what the answer is to that. When we look at the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, then it has other roles. So this is the part of the brain, this is your logical brain. This is your, let me think about this a little bit more. I'm going to plan, I want to strategize, I need to make decisions and kind of weigh the pros and cons. This is also part of the brain responsible for time travel. So when I talked to my daughter about this, and she's like, what are you talking about, time travel? And I said, time travel is really this concept where you can picture yourself at a different point in your life. So most people can kind of think about what they were like when they were younger. But to time travel, you can project yourself into the future. So I can think about a decision I might make today and then think about what the long-term consequences of that decision might be. So, this is important because if this doesn't develop until a little bit later, it can explain why some teenagers make decisions and you say, I don't know what they were thinking. Why did they do that? Did they not think of what would happen? And maybe they didn't, or they couldn't, because that part of their brain hasn't really been developed well yet. So they don't have that ability to time travel until their brain has more time to develop. So then I guess the questions come up about, how does this affect behaviors, and how does this affect just day-to-day life, these changes in the brain? Well, one of the areas that gets affected is emotional reactivity. As I said, that the emotional part is in that limbic system. And what I also said is that limbic system starts going a lot faster than the frontal part of your brain, which says, hold up, let's take a look and see if it makes a lot of sense. So kids are or teenagers are like one big emotion. And we all think about that, right? We think, oh, teenagers, they're all crying and laughing and that's all that they do, right? And part of that is developmental. It's part of our brains and how we develop. So, this can have some impact on just our day-to-day. And there was a doctor, her name is Dr. Deborah Yurgel-Un from Todd McLean Hospital. And she did a study looking at young people, adolescents, and also adults. And she showed them a range of pictures, and they asked people to interpret what they were seeing in the pictures. And what they were looking at was pictures of faces and seeing what kind of expression were they able to pick out of these faces. And what they found was that for younger people, they tended to see aggression in neutral faces. And aggression is a very primal feeling, right? People kind of can tend towards that one quite quickly, where adults tended to see other things. They tended to see, well, I think they're maybe a little bit scared, or there's something going on, maybe some fear. So I think this is quite interesting. So where a youth would tend to get the same stimulus or same experience and interpret it one way, adults are interpreting it a very different way. So this might help explain those times when you come down in the morning and you say to your 15-year-old daughter, so, what do you got going on today? And she goes, why? What do you think I'm going to do today? And I go, nothing. I'm just trying to be friendly, but she's interpreting my questions in a way that she's taking it as a challenge. So it might make those mornings a little bit smoother if you can kind of understand that they might not be able to read your facial expressions the way that you think that they can. So we look at this and go, okay, so there's obviously some emotional reactivity. The other thing we all know, though, is that part of all this emotional reactivity is puberty, right? And we think that, once they go through puberty, we're kind of lost, because then it's emotions and hormones and they're all flying around all over the place. And then it leads to fighting, a lot of conflict in the home. So here, this is also another really interesting thing, because most of the research I've been showing suggests that the hormonal changes in puberty actually have less of a role in that emotional reactivity than these brain changes do. Okay? And the other piece that I found really interesting was a study that was done by Doctors Ellis and Essex from the University of Arizona. So they thought about this idea that, you go through puberty and suddenly there's all this conflict in the house. And they said, maybe we've got that completely backwards. Maybe it's the opposite way. And you think, what are you talking about? Well, what they did is they started to follow kids from childhood, and they just monitored them through their childhood, through puberty, into their adolescence. And what they discovered was that those kids who had more conflict in their home from the get-go went into puberty earlier. So the conflict was actually having an impact on their hormones. So, I mean, there's obviously lots of reasons why people go into puberty at a certain time, and we know that there's nutritional impacts and just genetic impacts. But I thought this was quite fascinating because we always assume that it's the puberty that increases the conflict, but maybe it's the conflict that was already there. Okay? And if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, this makes complete sense. So if you are, years ago and you're living with your little tribe and you've got your family unit and everybody's fighting, and there's a risk that you're going to be kicked out of your tribe to go out into the wilderness and have to survive on your own. The best thing for your genes is to be able to reproduce as quickly as possible, because otherwise the chances of you not surviving are high. So we want to propagate our genes. We want to carry on our gene pool. So it would make sense that a lot of conflict would trigger you to go into that maturity sooner. Now, of course, in our day and age, when people get kicked out of their homes earlier, there's more risks than just, a lion or a bear in the woods, because those kids are now more vulnerable to be exploited. So I just found this a really interesting concept, and I thought that other people might find it interesting as well. Okay, so then we think all I've talked to you about is all the bad things, right, about emotions. Like, why is there anything good about this? We've heard about, mood swings and conflict and all of this stuff. But there's also a real positive side of this emotional reactivity. And I bring you to this picture. Now, this is a picture of my daughter's bedroom wall. Okay? So for those of you who don't know these 5 boys, this is One Direction, a boy band from the United Kingdom. And probably about 2 years ago, my daughter discovered this band, right? And just fell in love with these young boys. And she said, Mom, you have to listen to this music. It's just so wonderful. And, I'd listen, oh, yeah, it's great. But then it became more for her. Not only did she listen to the band, but then she started looking for posters. She had to go on to, the Teen Beat, the young people magazines, and start pulling all their posters. And then we had to go and get bigger posters. And you can see the one of Louis is like a 5-foot tall poster that sits in her room. And then came the Ardeen and the bracelets and the pins and the diary books, and then it was, we need to go to the pop-up store for One Direction. So I had to go down there, in the middle of winter, try and find this little store and buy hoodies and buy all, like the onesie, because she did the onesie from One Direction, because everybody had the onesie. And then we had to go to their concert. And that was a really hard thing, because their concert tickets went on sale a year before anybody even knew who they were. My daughter knew, and she said, you have to buy them. But I was like, I thought they were a flash-in-the-pan band, right? Oops, I was so wrong. So I had to go out and find these tickets. We were actually on vacation when the concert came to Vancouver. So we were away. We came back specifically to go to the concert that night, and then returned on our vacation the next day. My daughter then also started writing stories. She started writing fan fiction. And, and all the fan fiction was like, she's working in a hotel, and the band comes in, and they think she's really cute, and they ask her if she will come on tour with them, and then Niall Horan falls in love with her, and then her best friend falls in love with Harry Styles, and it's like, and every story ended that way. Like, they always fell in love with my daughter. And you may laugh about the idea of fan fiction, but this is a huge industry now. In fact, just at Christmas time, another girl who wrote One Direction fan fiction had all her books published. They're called After. And my daughter was like, you have to read these fan fiction. I was like, it's a huge industry. So my point is, as far as emotional reactivity, my daughter had such a passion about this band. Like, she loved One Direction. Sad to say that she has now taken down the wall, because she's moved on. Now she's moved on to the Vine boys from MagCon, and loves them even. Anyways, It's something, right? So she showed so much passion for this. She spent all of her time, all of her energy. And you think, if we could channel that passion of an adolescent, and you could take that passion and move it on. So you can think about some young people who get a passion at this age. Now maybe her passion is going to turn into her being a creative writer, because her stories are fabulous. Maybe someone gets a passion for music, and that turns into something that they develop in their life. But the important thing, I think, for me is when I look at my life and where I'm at, do I have that same level of passion anymore? Is my every waking moment thinking about what Harry Styles is wearing today? Or am I tweeting that? Am I following them on every kind of social media site that I can? No, because we've kind of changed. As much as our brain development has brought us to a place of contemplation and good decision making and organization, we've lost some of that. We've lost that passion just for being. And so it's kind of sad, but it's sad for us, not for them. So we also have to think about, in that celebration of the adolescent brain, there's some real great things that can come out of that emotion. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is novelty seeking, risk taking. So here's another thing that happens, of course, when you're a teenager, is you start to make some decisions that adults often go, I don't think that's the best idea. And when we think about risk-taking, we all sometimes confuse that with impulsivity. So impulsivity and risk-taking are actually two different things. Impulsivity is, something that actually decreases consistently over the lifespan. So if you had a 2-year-old child and they just dart off into traffic, or they just take something they don't even know and put it in their mouth, that's part of the impulsivity. That starts to go away. Teenagers aren't doing that kind of thing. When you talk about risk-taking, that's different. Children are not huge risk-takers, okay? They're not out there going, hey, let's jump off this cliff. Wouldn't that be fun? But adolescents do that kind of thing, and then it kind of drops off again. Adults are not great risk-takers, so it's like a big peak in adolescence. And we know that that there's some positives to risk-taking, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but there's also some negatives. The risk of a young person dying from misadventure increases by 300% in adolescence. The causes of death for adolescents, number one is car accidents, and the chance that is associated with driving too fast, speeding, reckless driving, or substance use is high. The next causes for death can be suicide or homicide. Right? So we know that there is increased risk-taking in adolescence. I wanted to kind of demonstrate a little bit of this, and I'm going to turn to the Nature of Things documentary called Surviving the Teenage Brain. And I want to show you a small clip from that. There's a young boy here named Trevor Christensen, and he's going to demonstrate some risk-taking behaviors for us.
I was inspired by watching an old episode of Mr. Bean where he's sitting on the roof of his car because his car is filled with like furniture that he bought at the store, so he drives it on the roof. And I was like, oh, I could do that with a car. It would be super funny. I was holding on to a piece of rebar that was attached to the gas pedal and then steering from behind. So at the very last second, I let go of those and leaped as hard as I could so that I would clear over the box of the truck, the land, and then make it into the water. And it took a lot of precision and perfect timing, but everything worked out.
Right, so there's Trevor. If you haven't seen the Nature of Things documentary, Surviving the Teenage Brain, I highly recommend it. So there's Trevor, and as he said, he needed to have perfect timing to pull this off. I'm not sure if he really thought, using his time travel abilities, what would happen if he didn't have perfect timing. I think his mother was very clear about what could possibly happen, but he didn't really think about those things too much. He just kind of had an idea, and he went with it. And this is the kind of stuff that gets parents really concerned, right? Because he managed to do it. Some of us might think about that whole idea of Darwinism and survival of the fittest, right? And go, well, Darwin will out. If he survives it, I guess that means his genes are pretty good. If he doesn't, well, I don't know. What we're really talking about, again, is that limbic part of the brain. And we're going back into that limbic area where risk-taking comes in, and dopamine. Dopamine is that neurotransmitter, that chemical that gets released when you do something that's exciting, right? So for young people, when they do these risk-taking behaviors, they have this rush of dopamine into the brain, and it feels really good. So it encourages you to do it again because it feels so good. So for teenagers, of course, this causes some increased risk, right? Now there are some positives to risk taking, so it's not all bad news, right? What we do know is that for kids who take risks, like controlled risks, is actually a positive benefit. For those kids when they're teenagers who try some things, as adults, they're considered to be a bit more well-adjusted. Some of those risks might be, I think I'm going to try this course, or I might join the team. I think I'm going to go to a movie with this boy that I don't know. Those are all risk-taking behaviors of teenagers. And doing some of those is positive. Because I have seen young people who don't take any risks. That there's a boy I'm seeing recently who not only doesn't take risks in school, but has stopped going to school, has stopped really even leaving his bedroom. He stays inside all day, and that's a very safe place for him, but is also stopping him from learning about our world. So we know that there's some positives of doing risk, and it's a necessary part of our development and the development of a young person. But there's also some negatives, as I was kind of pointing out. So one of the downsides of that dopamine release is that it can be released from a number of different ways. It's not always doing a risk-taking behavior. That is a scary thing because kids can get injured. If Trevor hadn't been perfectly timed in his flying off of the roof of that car, it might have ended very differently. We might not be watching him on video. The other thing that we worry about, though, is substance use can also increase that dopamine release, right? So you can artificially have that same thrill just by drinking, by using cocaine, by dropping acid, all of those things. And when I mentioned earlier about the whole pruning and myelination, if you're using a pathway or you're doing a behavior repetitively, like drinking, like smoking pot, like doing any of those things, what happens is that circuit gets stronger. And what happens is it doesn't get pruned away. And it gets faster in your brain. So this leads to an increase in your risk for addiction. When we look at adolescent brains, the important thing is also the age that you start introducing that substance. So we know that the younger you start using a drug or alcohol, the more likely that you're going to become addicted to it. So if we look at the information about marijuana users, if you start smoking marijuana as an adult, about 1 in 10 people will become addicted to it. But if you start as a teenager, that goes up to 1 in 6. So about 20% of teenagers become addicted to that drug if they started in adolescence. And part of the reason behind that is the development of their brain. They're actually laying down tracks and turning this dirt road into a superhighway that's pushing them to use their substances. Same with alcohol. The younger you start drinking alcohol, the more likely you're going to become addicted to alcohol. So there is a whole movement that just says what a difference a year makes. Perhaps the message for young people is not don't use it all, but wait. Let your brain have a bit more time to develop without the influence of a drug or alcohol there, so that you're not laying down those tracks, so you're not having the same risks for dependence or other negative effects that those drugs can have, especially on a young brain. Okay? So then, again, we're kind of going, well, is there anything good about the brain? All this risk-taking and all this dopamine, is there anything positive? Well, the positive of dopamine is that not only does it get released in high risk-taking behaviors and drug use, but also in love. When when you fall in love, you get that same dopamine release. And Dr. Helen Fisher, who wrote a book called Why We Love, looked at this closely, and she put people in love into a brain scan, and she showed that dopamine reward pathway was lit right up because those people were in love. Now, the hard part is when there's a breakup, when you take away that love. Because what happens is the dopamine drops off, and it's like you're going into a withdrawal, similar to any kind of drug withdrawal. And the hard part for adolescents is, again, they don't have that time travel capability. They can't see that I'm going to be fine in a year from now. Their whole world is right now. And the pain they're feeling right now doesn't seem like it's ever going to end. And it is a huge deal for them. And young girls, when they're dealing with a breakup, they tend to have more supports. They tend to go towards their friends. They talk to their friends. Maybe they talk and talk and talk, and they talk to multiple people about the same thing over and over again. But at least they're reaching out. Where young boys can be different. Sometimes they tend more to isolate, and they will turn to drugs and alcohol to help deal with the emotional pain, or they might act more reckless in their driving, or get more irritable or angry and get into fights. But it's still kind of coming from that same place. It's that loss of dopamine and not knowing how to cope with that. So I know as adults, we see our teenagers in their breakups and go, oh, come on, just get it together. He was just a boy. You're only dating for 2 months. How serious can that be? But for a young person, that is it. That is their world. And we have to take that quite seriously, because some really bad things can happen for young people who are heartbroken. Okay. So this brings us to social engagement. This is the peers. There's always this concern that, oh my goodness, their friends are more important than I am, and all they want to do is hang out with their friends, and what their friends say is more important than me. And, in an evolutionary perspective, this is important. If you're one of those young people who has to take a risk, so you're at home living with your family unit, and, if you stayed within your family unit and you wanted to reproduce, the only people there are your brothers and your sisters and your mothers and your fathers, and that's not good for the gene pool. So you have to leave. You have to have enough risk-taking capability to say, you know what, I don't want to stay here anymore. I want to know what's over the next hill. I want to go out there. And then once you're out there, it's dangerous. You need to have some other people there to support you. And that's how that movement towards peer groups is beneficial, because all of these other people are in the same stage as you are, and they can support you. They can also lead you astray, but they're there for that reason. And many people that I know have talked about friendships that they made in high school that have continued throughout their entire lives. I have them. People that I still go look back and say, remember when we were in grade 9 together? And it helps us do time travel to go back there and remember our earlier selves. So there is some positives of teens hanging out with other peers, and we do want to encourage that in their ability to learn social skills and create some of those bonds. But we also know that there are some risks in being with your peers, and I'm going to turn to Trevor again to give us an example of when things could potentially go awry with your peer group.
Basically went to the dollar store and bought all these fireworks. We're like, well, what can we do with these? Oh, let's go to the skate park and blow ourselves up with them.
And one of the interesting things seems to be is that the presence of peers increases risk-taking behavior in teens.
Probably one guy by themselves would not have wanted to do it, but there was 5 or 6, and we're like, yeah, this would be so fun because we're all in there. I don't know, it makes you feel safer, I guess.
Okay, so you got to see more of Trevor. Trevor feels safer when he's in that space with all of his friends blowing themselves up than he would feel safe if he was by himself blowing himself up. And so, again, this is what we talk about as far as being with peers, because you make decisions when you're with your peers that are different than if you were by yourself. And we can see how we're trying to approach this, like with driver's licenses. Now, when I saw some research about driver's licenses, and you know how they have the graduated driver's licenses now? Well, part of that is because if you take a teenage driver and put a bunch of their friends in the car, their driving capabilities is as impaired as if they were drunk. They make reckless decisions, they drive too fast, they're at greater risk of being in accidents. So now we've got this policy change which says things like you can only have one teenager in the car with you at any one time, or at the beginning you're not allowed to have any young people in the car with you. You have to drive with an adult. So those are ways that we can try and change our policies to try and protect youth from the things that happen in their brains which are just completely natural. So really what we're talking about as well as that social engagement is the effect of that on decision making. Because the way that adolescents make decisions is different than the way that adults make their decisions. Adolescents tend to weigh the positives of the behavior that they want to do higher, or they weight that greater than the negatives of the behavior that they want to do. So where adults might do it the opposite, they'd go, that might be good, but look at all these bad things that could happen. Again, we're time traveling into the future and seeing all the bad. Where the young person's going, that's nothing. Look at all these great things that could come from me doing this. So they tend to make those decisions. Now, if we're thinking about risk-taking in decision-making, Lawrence Steinberg did a really interesting study where he took young people and put them again in a brain scan and asked them to complete a questionnaire where they were asked to make some choices on questions, and the choices would kind of give an insight into how risky your decision was, right? Or how risky the behavior was that you chose to do. So you get a sense of how risk-taking this young person was. So then he did something really smart, is that he hooked that young person up to a microphone and he put his friends on the microphone so he could listen to his friends, and he was told his friends could see which choices he was making. Now the friends could talk to him, but what the young person didn't know was that the friends were not allowed to influence his decision. In fact, they were completely scripted in what they said to him. What they discovered was that when a young person believes his friends are watching him, his risk-taking increases by 100%. Right? So if other people know what you're doing, I'm going to jump off that cliff because I have to, because I got to, keep my name. I don't know what that is. When they did this same study with college students, so the brains are a little bit more developed, but maybe not fully matured. I'll talk about that word mature later. What they found is the risk-taking still increased by about 50%. And when they put adults in the same thing, there was no change in what decisions that we made, regardless of whether our peers were looking at us or not. So, what do we do with that? We know that young people are going to make some decisions that might not be in their best interest if they're with their friends. So as parents, we have to be aware of this. We can't kind of leave them and not kind of still supervise. You have to still be involved even when your youth is with their friends. Maybe more so when your youth are with their friends. Check it in on them, because sometimes things can get away from them really quickly. Okay. Another area that can be impacted by our brain development is creativity. Okay? So when you're a young person, you don't have yet any kind of fixed mental set. So there's no specific rules on things that says you can't do this, you can't do this, you have to do that. So that puts them in a position of being able to just kind of dream. Not only that, but young people have the time to dream. So I think back into my adolescence, and I remember getting up on a sunny weekend morning and just grabbing a blanket and my ghetto blaster, if that ages me, and maybe a book and something to eat, and going out in the backyard, laying on the grass, and that's it. That's all I did. I just laid there all day, right? Now as an adult, I think, I should go and do that. And then I go outside, I sit in the sun, and about a half an hour later I think, oh, you know what? I should really think, what are we having for dinner? I don't know if we have enough groceries. Where are the kids? Maybe I better answer some emails. I should, I don't have time to just sit there and dream, right? Where adolescents have that. And they also don't have the constraints that's holding them back. So sometimes that prefrontal cortex can kind of get in the way, right? So I want to show you yet another video from The Nature of Things, Surviving the Teenage Brain. You're going to learn about a different boy this time. This is Marshall and what he's done as far as being creative.
In the cystic fibrosis lab at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital, one volunteer lab assistant was getting a lot of attention in early 2011.
I'm Marshall Zhang.
Not just because of his age,
I'm 16 years old.
but because in his first ever experiment, he made a groundbreaking discovery that had been missed by seasoned researchers.
That's really exciting. It's very exciting, and it means to us that this is going to be a fruitful way to move forward.
To do this, Marshall had to teach himself a complex molecular imaging program,
Definitely a big challenge.
and then trust his results, even though experts said the compounds he wanted to combine would cancel each other out.
And so we carried out the experiment, and on that Friday when we took out the results, not only were the compounds not having to compete with each other, they're actually working together synergistically in creating an effect that was greater than the sum of its parts. So it was almost like seeing 1 + 1 = 3 in front of my face, and that was just mind-blowing.
A remarkable achievement by a 16-year-old, and yet one a 16-year-old brain might just be best suited to make.
Marshall didn't see any limits to applying these methods, whereas, when you're a little bit older and you've got a certain set of what limitations there might be in a particular area, you feel that there's maybe some barriers to moving in a particular direction, but Marshall didn't see any of those barriers.
So it's so fascinating what you can do when you don't have any constraints. So Marshall was able to try something that all the adults would say, that can't be done. And he said, well, I don't know that. I need to prove it myself. And then he did something new, or he discovered something that shouldn't have worked, but he did it anyways. When you think about some of the downstreams of this creative process, you think about it. You get an idea or a passion that starts in your adolescence. We know that it survives the pruning. It gets myelinated. It gets laid down. It carries on into adulthood, where you now have the capability of bringing that idea to fruition. So if you think about some of these pictures I have here on the screen, the Beatles, Bill Gates, Mozart, Mark Zuckerberg, Einstein, all of these guys started doing things in their teenage years, some of them even before. And they brought those ideas and that passion, and it has had a major impact on changing our world. So I don't think I can talk about adolescence without just touching on sleep, because this comes up a lot in my clinical work, is the issue of sleep deprivation in teenagers. And my kid stays up all hours of the night, and then I can't get them out of bed in the morning. And the truth is that with the brain changes, the clock, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that tells your brain when to turn on and fall asleep, changes in adolescence. The way that we measure that is through the release of something called melatonin. And some of you have probably used melatonin over the counter to help your kids fall asleep. Melatonin is a natural hormone that gets released in the brain. And what we find is in adolescence, that melatonin is starting to get released a bit later at night than in adults, about 2 hours later. So for some adolescents, 11 o'clock, where the parents are like, they can barely keep their eyes awake, the kids are they're up, and they're on their phone, and they're like, I'm not tired at all. And then at 7 o'clock in the morning, when the parents are up, you can barely drag your kid out of bed because they're still needing all that sleep. The average adolescent needs about 9.25 hours of sleep a night, and most of them are not getting that. They're getting closer to 6 to 7 hours per night, and then what they do is they play catch-up on the weekends. So, in my own household, if my daughter sleeps in on a Saturday or Sunday morning, I say, I don't mind at all. I need you to catch up on that sleep, because I know our school system and our culture doesn't support adolescent brains as far as their sleep patterns go. The reason why kids go to school for 8 o'clock in the morning and end at 3 is because I have to go to work. And I want to work at these hours, and I don't want to be up late at night because then I'm too tired. So the kids have to adapt to us rather than us adapting to them. It's just the way that we run our world. So you got to give them a little bit of a break on that one. All right, so really we've talked a lot about adolescence and evolution, and really with evolution, if we didn't have adolescence, we wouldn't have evolved as a species, because the adolescent brain is really that adaptive brain, that brain that changes in response to our environment. Any of us, sad to say, but our brains were perfectly adapted to a world that existed years ago. I was dead on when I was 15 to 25. Unfortunately, my brain is still there, and the world is not the same as it was then. So I struggle to understand some of the things, like how can this all be about social media and how is all this changing? And we see people kind of pushing against that. Oh, we don't like these changes because we don't understand it, because our brains are not where the brains of these young people are. But we need that in order to evolve as a species. So I come to this idea of immature. And I hear this kind of get tossed around, oh, don't worry, you've just got an immature brain. One day you'll have a mature brain like me. And I think, I'm really careful about that terminology, because I think it sends a message to young people that, hey, our adult brains are the epitome. This is where you're trying to get. We're mature. We're the best brains. And I'm thinking, I don't know about that, because the adolescent brain is actually perfectly made to do exactly what it's supposed to do. So it's immature, like a fine wine might be immature, right? But it's not immature in that negative sense, like the brain needs to be whipped into shape or something like that. Because if you think about it, a young person's brain has potential to be anything. It could, if you think of it like a piece of clay or a block of marble, it could become a Statue of Liberty or a Sphinx or a Christ the Redeemer, or it could be a big lump of clay or a big block of marble. For us, we've already gone through that, and we can't go back and change it. Right? Which is sad. So that's why we need to celebrate these young people's brain, because they are the future. They have all this potential. I want to talk a little bit about attitudes, and because I work mainly with young people who are dealing with mental health and substance use, I really look towards that substance use piece and cannabis, because that seems to come up in my world almost every day. And when I looked at this study called What Canadian Youth Think About Cannabis from September 2013, and when I look over what they think about it, I can see how brain development is impacting their beliefs. So here's what we have. If you take some input, absent parental relationships, okay, so there's nobody guiding them. So we think again, young person doesn't have that prefrontal cortex working very well. They're all emotions and drives. And if they don't have anybody who's that external kind of brain for them, it changes the way that they interact, right? If the parents don't tell them about what they think about marijuana, leave them kind of openly guessing, again, that's going to change their attitudes or impact them. If parents are actually using themselves, modeling this behavior, youth would look to them and copy that behavior. A lot of youth believe that all other youth are using marijuana. This goes back to that idea of social engagement. What my friends do is the truth. But they don't know every kid out there. And actually the truth is not every kid is using marijuana every day. But when you are that kid, you tend to hang out with other kids that all do the same thing. Peers are often encourage other kids to use marijuana to help them. They'll say, you know what, it helped me when I was feeling this or when I was feeling that, and you should use pot too. And let's be honest, there are so many mixed messages about marijuana out there. Is marijuana illegal, or is it a medicine? Right? Do we only get arrested because we get caught with it? Because I can go down to the steps of the art gallery on April 20th and join a whole bunch of people out there smoking marijuana openly on the street, and they're not getting arrested. So what does that mean? Right? As well, adolescents they have some understanding of the harms. They can see that it's a health risk, that it can affect their academics and their relationships. They can get dependent on it, and it can affect their focus and lead to laziness and physical health problems. But they don't necessarily have a complete understanding of the health risks as far as psychosis or impact on the development of the IQ in the developing brain. They also see the health problems that come from marijuana as idiosyncratic or specific to the person who's using that drug. So if me and my friend are both using pot and that person gets psychotic, that's because that person was weaker than I am. It's all about them. It has nothing to do with the pot that we're smoking, with the fact that I'm smoking it. It's that person. And it won't happen to me because I'm special. I'm different, right? And they also don't see that there's any long-term negative effects, and that might be impacted by their ability to time travel. They do see some benefits with it. I can focus better, I can relax, I can sleep better, I'm more creative, and it treats mental health. So again, that's part of those mixed messages, because you hear people getting their medical marijuana to deal with their irritability, or their ADHD, or their bipolar illness, or their schizophrenia, or all of that. But where is the evidence behind all that? That's my question, because it's sure not in any of the books that I'm seeing that says first-line treatment of everything is marijuana, right? So we don't have the evidence to support that. So again, we've got youth who have in their decision-making putting more weight on the positives of the behavior and less weight on the negatives of the behavior. And what does that lead to is young people's attitudes is that marijuana is safe, it's natural, and it's not a hard drug. And what we know is that as your perceived risk, if you think it's safe, you're more likely to use it. And this is just a graph from the Monitoring the Future study from the University of Michigan, which shows that risk and use go together. Okay. So this comes to parents. What are parents supposed to do? Like, how do we help our young people when there's all these changes going on in their brains? Well, Lawrence Steinberg is a prolific writer, and he writes a lot of books for parents, and he's kind of come up with these 10 tips for parenting teens. And it comes from a book called The 10 Basic Principles of Good Parenting. I'm just going to quickly run through what he recommends, because they all make a lot of sense. One is that what you do as a parent makes a difference. So if you're not talking to youth, that matters. If you are talking to them, if you are using, what you do and the model that you're setting is important. Okay? Another one is that you can't be too loving. You can't go out there and hug your kids too much or tell them you love them too much. There's no limit on that. You need to stay involved in your young person's life. You can't abdicate and say, well, I'm not going to be their parent because their peers are more important to them, so I'm just going to drop out. You still need to be involved in their life. They still need your guidance for their decision making. You have to be able to adapt your parenting skills, because your youth is a moving target. What they're like, their brain is like at 14 is not the same at 15, is not the same at 16. You have to continue to set limits on their behavior, because they don't have any limits right now. So you have to be able to go in and do that. You need to foster their independence, so you have to give them some chances to take some risks in a safe way. You need to be consistent. The decision you make today is the same decision that you make tomorrow, and they need to know that it's not going to change. You have to explain your decisions, because these young people are working through their emotions. They're not necessarily using that frontal part of their brain, so you have to be very clear and explain things to them and be consistent. You want to avoid that harsh discipline. There's no benefit to corporal punishment of trying to encourage your youth to do something by harming them or punishing them. That only can break the attachment and the trust. And finally, don't try to be your teenager's friend. You're not their peer. You're not their best friend. You could never be equal with them. They might want to tell you everything about their boyfriend and what's going on, but it's not okay for you to tell them everything about what's going on with your boyfriend or your spouse. right? There's a reason why there's a difference, why you're a parent and not their best friend. So I think we're going to wrap up here, and I'll turn it back to Victoria.
Great. If we can just advance a bit. So what I love is that you're here reminding us with such passion and creativity on how to celebrate our kids' passion, creativity, being a dreamer, and getting out there and trying new things. And that, although it's scary for us parents, it sure explains a whole lot of the decisions I made as a youth. And it's that bringing it together and knowing that there's reasons behind the things they do, and it's not all about the fact that they're doing it for a reason to drive us crazy and help us lose our mind. They're just losing parts of theirs while they gain other ones. So just to thank you and remind you about filling out the feedback form, there will be a couple more slides on this that you can look at later as you go home and want to look at the resources again. And I thank you for your time and being here with us today. And thank you so much for your time and, again, supporting it and being with families and kids on that level of meeting them where they're at and loving them for who they are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.